Hello and welcome to this episode of Focus On with myself, Fifi Peters. Now, the Africa Energy Indaba 2025 is set to take place in March in Cape Town under the theme Igniting the Power Revolution. The annual event aims to bring together industry leaders and government representatives, financiers, as well as innovators to discuss the future of energy in Africa. Topics like energy access, renewable energy, and the role of new technologies in meeting Africa's energy needs will be top of mind for all stakeholders. And joining me in studio for more on gas as a source of energy on the continent is Mzi Chokolo, the Group CEO at SLG Gas. Mzi, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today. So as the Group CEO of SLG Gas, when you apply your mind to Africa's energy transition and the role of gas, how do you see gas fitting in that picture in the context of balancing economic growth, of course, and sustainability?
As SLG and myself personally as CEO of that group, which has been plying its trade in the natural gas space for the last 23 years, it's just an exciting space and an exciting time to be talking about effectively the transition that not only South Africa is at the cusp of, but I think the world is starting to embrace gas as a very strong transition fuel. And all it really means for people like ourselves and our stakeholders is that we're standing, I'm going to say, at the precipice of a very, very big opportunity and a very exciting time. And for young leaders like myself, it is certainly an opportune time to do a little mark on the footnote of history of some of the contributions I would have brought to the table in that time.
What are you hoping to leverage from a strategic point of view in terms of your objectives internally?
Yeah. So a conversation about energy in South Africa, especially with the background I've just given, shouldn't happen without a company like ourselves being in the conversation. So not only are we a participant at Africa Energy Indaba, we are actually a partner. And there's a certain part of me that feels we are duty bound after 23 years of having been in this space and having been a successful participant at that. It is also important, therefore, that we start shaping the conversations that happen around energy, and the strategic conversations that will be taking place at the Indaba certainly warrants what I call some local knowledge. We are on the ground on a daily basis. We trade gas to the industry of South Africa, to the power producers of this country. We understand what it takes to bring gas onshore. We understand what it's going to take to trade gas successfully, which is a critical aspect of this whole thing. It is therefore important for us to be in conversation with potential investors, developers, potential off-takers and markets, and be able to shape the conversation that not only effectively serves South Africa's energy deficit, but also does so responsibly. You touched on the fact that we need to consider an environmental impact of gas, for instance, or our activities. And it's an important thing to consider, but in a very balanced way. Driving here this morning, I was thinking gas is such a versatile tool to be used. It's both an economic enabler, it's a political tool in the, I'm going to call it the wrong hands. It is also a social development tool, and we need to balance all these interests. So it can't just be measured in the context of returns on investment by those that want to put money into it.
Sure.
It also needs to be measured in the context of social capital that's been acquired in our deploying gas, and the environmental dividends, in other words, that using gas also bring. And those we can discuss further, certainly are much, much better than coal, for instance.
Sure. Because of the fragility of our infrastructure framework on the continent.
Yeah.
So talk to us about the successful trade of gas within the country, regionally, and what that looks like, what it will take.
Sure. So perhaps to just gonna peel the historical curtain a little bit back. So about 23 years ago, we were founded through a partnership with Sasol, which is effectively, Sasol Gas has been the biggest and long-standing sort of supplier of gas in the country. And through that partnership came the founding of SLG as a company. And we have, over the 2 decades, have really honed our skills in trading gas both to commercial and industrial customers, which is really where gas is used at scale. And of course, in addition to that, is gas being deployed for power production purposes. So in that, not only have we then been able to hone our skills in how you acquire gas in a way that is not only conducive for you to be able to trade it out successfully, but we also understand that there are market dynamics that shape what gas should cost, how it's being used, where it's transported, how it's transported, etc. And we've effectively want to leverage that skill set to where we are today, which is where we, as I said, in this sort of exciting time, not only is South Africa running out of its current sort of source of primary gas, which is Sasol's gas in Mozambique, but we're now needing to buy a new source, new gas from a new supplier. We don't know who that is. All we know is currently the next source of South Africa's gas most likely is going to be international LNG suppliers. So the skill of being able to contract gas, in other words, this is all negotiated contracts, very stringent terms, very strict performance guarantees required, huge money being put in terms of those guarantees. So that's the first part and the first hurdle we need to get over. And the second part, I mean, you touched on it, is this gas is not used where it's delivered generally. Gas is transported around, firstly, in country, it's moved around in pipelines. And in the context of the new gas source, which is LNG, it's going to need to be landed in South Africa into infrastructure that still needs to be developed. And that new infrastructure needs to tie into existing infrastructure and be able to not only be used in the current context, but in new development as well. So we need to not only ensure that our existing infrastructure is capable and sufficient, and I must say now, disclaimer, this is not something SLG is going to do by itself. This is something we need to do with our partners. Those partners exist. You have the likes of Transit Pipelines, Sasol Gas Pipelines, everybody who's actually been developing and operating infrastructure for the many decades this is happening in the country. But we've also got new players that are going to come into the space. The thing is with new players, they always need to learn from the old dogs, if you know what I mean, right? Then, of course, you have to deal with the fact that South Africa's current infrastructure is also aging. And so in aging infrastructure, there's a need for two things. One, is there a reinvestment in that existing infrastructure to get it to gear it up for the new, let's call it the new phase of gas consumption, or do we replace it? And all of this is going to cost huge amount of capital, which needs to be managed in the context of it all comes down to the right price. If we load costs on this gas, etc., ultimately we won't be able to sell it to the market. And that's the one thing. And then, of course, you have to start thinking regionally. How do we leverage existing infrastructure, for instance, the Romco pipeline that joins South Africa to Mozambique? Can that infrastructure, which for all intents is only 25 years old, pipelines exist in the ground for 50 to 70 years. And so there's still another 30, 50 years or so of that pipeline that's still available for it to be utilized. So we certainly need to start engaging. And this is where I see bilateral conversations, country to country. How does South Africa still source new gas through Mozambique, utilizing existing pipelines to be able to bring that gas to South Africa? The benefit of that to South Africa, I touched on it earlier, it manages the capital cost of bringing the gas into the country, amongst other things. And then, of course, when you start going wider into the continent, you start dealing with issues of an Africa that has got the resources but no infrastructure. Secondly, Africa is a much more, I'm going to call it sparsely populated continent. So there's huge distances to cover to move. So the logistics of moving gas from source to where it's used start becoming a major determinant as to whether gas is successfully deployed in certain markets. So this is all, and if I achieve anything with that, Fifi, is that it's a lot of work. It's big work. It's going to require multiple expertise to consolidate and harmonize into something that's successful. And we stand there not fooled by the fact that not one particular entity or country can actually solve not only regional but the continent's problem.
When you evaluate the investment landscape and the appetite to play more in the space with the partners that you did make reference to, what does that look like, and who needs to do what perhaps to accelerate the pace of capital coming in the sector?
Sure. Look, maybe any investment is always informed by the nature of the opportunity, right? So currently, I mean, the most recent discoveries of gas, 40% of those are in Africa as a continent.
Sure.
And currently, South Africa only is really basically supplying about 4% of the natural gas being used around the world. The sad part about it, though, is that most of Africa's gas is being exported. So let's just kind of hang that as a point. What it really means is there's an opportunity that is pretty attractive from is there a product to extract? Certainly. Are there markets? And that's the nice thing with gas. Gas is not necessarily a product for local markets anymore. We've seen this. It happens the world over, is that gas is produced in one part of the world and it's sold to a different part of the world. So we certainly know there's a market. So the key considerations, though, for investment, especially let's start with the South African context, is these are not 5-year projects. Big money requires long-term certainty. It also requires long-term guarantees that the anticipated returns that were the reason for the investment in the first place will indeed be achieved. And so that requires really a country that has its house in order.
Sure.
From a policy predictability point of view, and therefore an enabling environment as well for these investments to happen. You touched, for instance, on the Mozambican case, where international oil companies, as they often do, came en masse to Mozambique, took up acreages, and did all of the work to explore, and have established that there's a huge reserve of gas in Mozambique, which will effectively multiply the fortunes of that country. And when it came the moment to extract the gas, and then it became a classical contention as to who's the boss. It frustrated the progression of the project. It therefore put the investments in abeyance, and it all came down to political instability. Right? Energy projects are very long term, and in a country like ours, which we all now know, the bank balance is not very strong. It's not healthy. We need help. But to enable the help, it's kind of like one of those classical says, help me, help you kind of cases, right? So we need to create the environment that enables the investors to bring the money we need so we can then take this development forward.
I see that amongst other things, you are a fan of the classic Jerry Maguire, in which that movie, that line, help me, help you, came from. But Mzi, I think that you have given us quite a lot of pointers that will be discussion points at the Energy Indaba, and we look forward to unpacking them a lot further with you, of course, as a channel on the ground in Cape Town.
I hope to see you guys there.
100%. That is actually how we wrap up our conversation of this week's episode of Focus On. Thanks again to my guest who joined me in the studio, Mr. Mzi Chokolo, the Group CEO at SLG Gas. And from myself, Fifi Peters, it is goodbye for now.